just as like a PSA, my friend told me I should mention this. So, because I guess now Clubhouse doesn't have the same age restrictions that it used to, if there are any kids, because I talk about some gruesome stuff. So no, no, no. If there's anyone under 18, just yeah, parental discretion advised because it gets pretty dark in here, and I don't want to be responsible for that. So, we're gonna do Bible John today, and I was hoping Jenny might be around because she's from that area, I think, right? But maybe she'll pop in. I'll ping her in, and maybe she'll pop in later. Wait, look, where's your name? There we go. Cool. Okay, so let's get going. So this story happens in Glasgow, Scotland, so a bit across the pond from where we are, or I am anyway, but so I might be a little bit rough on a couple of the names, but doing my best. But this is still an unsolved mystery to this day, and the biggest one in Scotland to this day. And they got into theories and what they have for evidence stuff a little bit later, but you'll kind of see what's happening. And the sad part is it's not because they're not trying to solve it, as some of the cases, it seems like what I cover in the US, it's like, how is it not solved? This one, it seems like they really were putting all their police power into it, and it's still not solved, so it's kind of a bummer. But here, I'll start with some pictures that I have here while I talk about them. Here are the three known victims of Bible John, and I will start with Patricia. So on February 22nd of 1968, Patricia Docker, she was a 25-year-old nurse with brown hair and brown eyes, and she was a very pretty young lady. She was petite in size. She had recently separated from her husband, and she was living at this point at home with her parents and her 4-year-old son. She was still married, but she was separated. She would normally work nights, but on this night, February 22nd, she had the night off, so she wanted to go out with some of her friends. Patricia told her family that she was going to the Majestic Ballroom, and she actually ended up going to the Barrowland Ballroom instead, and that ends up being a point of confusion later on and why it takes a while to catch up when they're retracing her steps. But she tells her parents that she went to the Majestic Ballroom, and then it could have been that she started the night at the Majestic Ballroom and then she ended up at the Barrowland Ballroom, but as far as what we know, that she ended up at the Barrowland Ballroom by the end of the night. She could have also been lying about where she was going because the Barrowland Ballroom had this reputation. It had what was called 25 and over nights, and so those went from 8 o'clock to midnight on Thursdays and Saturdays, and basically it was referred to as a grab a granny night. So I guess it was a popular night where people would count people that were older, also like 25 and older. That's not really great granny age, but I guess it was just because that was like the older crowd. They would go in and pick up couples or whatever. And I was also said that a lot of the time people would go there without their spouses and then leave with people that weren't their spouses. So it was a night where people would go with the intention of either cheating or picking up chicks, whatever. So that might also be why she didn't tell her family that she was going to the Barrowland Ballroom, because it kind of had a not so great reputation for a recently separated lady. But yeah, so she goes there for the night and she was having a great time. It wasn't really found out who she spent a lot of time with, but as far as we know, she met a man at the Barrowland Ballroom and then she left with that man. Her story specifically, because it takes a while for the police to get to the Barrowland Ballroom, by the time they do, a lot of people didn't remember that night specifically. But when her body was found, the next morning, she was found by a 67-year-old man who was taking a shortcut on his way to work, and he saw something that he thought might have been a mannequin. And when he got closer, he touched it with his foot, and he said it felt like a block of ice, but he knew once he touched it that it was a real body. For some reason, this this part I got kind of confused by, but basically he said when he reported to the police that he thought it was a man. When she was found face up and completely nude. So it's not really clear why he reported to the police that he found a dead body that was a man. But because of this, the police took a little bit longer to get there because I guess they assumed that it was just another guy that, like a homeless man that had possibly died out in the cold. And so they didn't get there very quickly. Actually, it wasn't even the police that were called out that got there first. It was two officers that were just dispatched to a traffic stop nearby that ended up stopping and finding the body. And then once they got there, they called everyone else. And so it took a little bit for the investigators to get there for her. Once they did, they found rigor mortis had begun to set in, but it was clear that she had been beaten, raped, and strangled. The weapon they thought might have been a belt, but later on they concluded that it was probably the stocking that she was wearing, her own stocking. But the stocking for her wasn't found at the scene, and neither was any of her personal items. They weren't found on her either. No clothes were found with her, no handbag. Nothing was left behind. The only thing that they had left behind was a used sanitary napkin that was likely her own. So the sanitary napkin, basically, I don't know how to explain it. Like, women carry sanitary napkins usually when they're on, their time of the month. And so the coroner also concluded that she was on her period at the time of her murder. And that comes up again. So remember that all that was left behind was the sanitary napkin. So also where she was found was just a few yards away from her parents' home. So it was believed she was either attacked on her way home, or whoever killed her attacked her while walking her home. But she was pretty much just a few yards away from her parents' home, which is really sad because they were waiting up for her the night before. There was a report the night previously of a woman screaming, "Leave me alone," but nothing really came of that report. That was just what a neighbor said that she heard. There wasn't really any sighting of a man who had been with Patricia the night before, but again, this was because once they had finally ID'd her, so her parents actually read about them finding a body in the newspaper because they hadn't concluded who she was at that point yet. And her parents went in to report her missing after a few days, and they brought in her picture, and that's when the cops were like, "Oh, we actually found a body. Could you come in and identify it?" And that's how they identified the body. So it took a couple days for her parents to get to this police station and to identify the body. Once they did, the police immediately tried to retrace her steps, and her parents told them that she went to the Majestic Ballroom, and that's where they started their search. So it took them weeks before they actually realized that she went to the Maryland Ballroom instead, and they had to shift over there and start from scratch all over again because they had been asking questions at the Majestic Ballroom, and it was a bunch of confusion. So, I mean, what we learned from that is don't lie about where you're going just in case something happens so they can be quick with it. But, from here, they, like I said, didn't get there for a while, and they couldn't get any good witnesses' statements because they really couldn't remember the date at that point. It was weeks past. So they did searches nearby looking for her belongings, and they ended up dredging up a river and found her handbag in the river, but it didn't have anything in it, and they didn't have any more clues in it as to who the murderer might have been. But even though this crime was a really gruesome crime, the police thought at this point that it was a one-off, and they just kind of kept on searching, but they didn't have much to go on. And it wasn't until 18 months later that they found another woman in a similar way. On a Saturday night on August 14th of 1969, 23-year-old Jemima McDonald left her 3 kids with her sister so she could go out on a night on the town. Most of Jemima's friends were married, so it wasn't strange for her to go to the clubs alone because all her friends didn't want to go or couldn't go. What was strange was she didn't come back to pick up her kids the next day. She loved her kids. She would never just leave her kids at her sister's place. She just wanted to go out and have a good night. So it was very confusing when her sister found that she wasn't coming home the next day. Her sister started to become worried, and even more, she started to hear rumors from neighborhood kids talking about a body that they had found in an abandoned house. So apparently there was this house in this area that was used by kids during the day as like a hangout spot. And then at night, it was a known place where sex workers would bring dates and do drugs. So it was kind of a seedy spot, but I guess it was kind of everyone in the community knew about it. So her sister overheard kids talking about a dead body that they found. And she at this point hadn't even gotten to say that her sister was missing, because she was still waiting for her to come back. So she ends up going to this abandoned house to see if the neighborhood kids were lying about this body. And when she walks in, so it wasn't until the following Monday that she goes to look at this to see if the body was really there. When she walks into this abandoned house, she finds, and this house was about 30 yards from her own home. So again, it seemed like it happened while Jemima was on her way back. On the floor, she found what she thought could have been a tailor's dummy, but then she realized that it was an actual body, and she could see that it was Jemima's body. And from the looks of it, once the investigators got there, they said that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled with her own stocking again. When authorities got called in, they started checking the scene, and her clothes were still on her, but they were a mess. Some of them had been taken off. Some of them were shredded to pieces. Specifically, her underwear had been torn up, but everything that she could have been wearing was accounted for except for her own handbag. There was also at the scene was a sanitary napkin laying next to her body, and the medical examiner also found that Jemima was on her period at the time of her death. So the police started to canvass the area, and they find out that Jemima had started her night at a bar across the street from the Barrowland Ballroom, and then she was seen talking to a man with red hair. And according to witnesses, Jemima and the young man went to the Barrowland Ballroom after and were dancing together for some time, and then they left the club together. When they asked witnesses for what the man looked like, they said that he looked like a man 25 to 35, and that he was tall, likely over 6 feet tall, and he was dressed very well in a blue suit with a white shirt. And according to the people that worked at the Barrowland Ballroom, he was not a regular. People that went to these 25 and over nights, they were pretty much regulars. They saw the typical crowd once again, in this guy specifically, they could not pinpoint as a regular. So that's kind of what they gathered from this case. So even though Glasgow was a large city, and that was just a bullet point, that there was lots of regulars that came to these rabid granny nights. So that's why the fact that he didn't stick out is suspicious. So let's see. So like I said, police think that Jemima was either attacked on her way back to her sister's place, or that someone was escorting her home and got attacked by the person escorting her home. And even though these two first cases are pretty similar, they're 18 months apart from each other. So it actually takes quite a while for police to link the two together. It took 10 weeks actually before they could link them together. So they're treating them as separate one-off cases, and that's a problem because they're already lost. They have really no account for what happened to Patricia, and this could really help them. At least they have witnesses to remember what he looked like, but they don't link these two cases together for 10 weeks, so it takes a while. But they did, in the area, they did put together a lot of, announcements that they, like the band at the Barrowland Bar, would always make announcements before they play about the police investigation, asking anyone that knew anything to come forward. And the police were also pushing that in the media for anyone to come forward if they had information about what they saw that night. But it was difficult to get accounts on what was happening that night because people that went there didn't saying that they went there because, they could get caught. So the police tried to push that if they came forward, they could come forward anonymously, but it still didn't really help get witnesses. They really were only able to get the info from the people that were already working at the Barland Bar. So yeah, this takes 10 weeks for them to group them together. And once they had assembled a team, they make a sketch based on the limited sightings that they had. And this was actually the first ever sketch in a criminal investigation by the Scottish police. And when I was trying to figure out why, but also when I was listening to the podcast, they mentioned that it was because, I guess, if you have a sketch, like we might use them in the US a lot, but I guess the sketch can actually make it difficult when you're trying to convict someone of something. They can just point to well, he doesn't look exactly like this. So they don't use them as often over there. But because they were in this stressful situation and all they really had to go on was what the witnesses saw, they used sketch and they put it out to the media. And I'm going to put that up in a second. So after this, on October 29th of 1969, there was a third attack. And this one, he really kind of gives a lot more clues, and it's because he leaves a witness that was with him for most of the night. So on this night, October 29th, a 29-year-old wife and mother of two named Helen Puddock, she had just moved back to Scotland from Germany. Her and her military husband had been stationed in Germany for a while, so when they moved back, they were at first living with Helen's mother just to get settled before finding a place. And on this night, October 29th, she wanted to go out dancing with her friends. So it was her sister and a couple of her neighborhood friends that all went out together. And her husband really didn't like the idea of her going out, but she assured him that she used to go out all the time and that she's going out with her friends. They're not going to leave each other. So her husband, George, actually gave her a 10 shilling note so she could grab a cab on the way home instead of taking the bus. So she had a plan to get home. So Helen's sister, Jane, came to pick her up, and then the two girls took the bus to the area that the Barland Bar was at. At this time, they had actually passed by flyers that were with the man's sketch on them, warning females in the area. They had already been put all over the area, and so they walked by him, but they figured, we're gonna stick together tonight, so we should be safe, and they went over to the bar. At first, they went to a local tavern, and then they went to the Barland Bar around 10 p.m. At some point, they met up with two men named John and John. One of the men named John had dark hair, and the other one had red hair. And Jean had assumed that they were both using fake names because going to the Barland Bar during these 25 and overnights, it's not uncommon for people to use fake names since they usually plan on just finding someone for the night. The two ladies danced with the men, and at some point during the night, there was a scene that was made between Jean and, I guess Jean, her sister, had lost some money in the cigarette vending machine, and she got mad at the manager of the bar. So one of the Johns came to her rescue, the dark-haired one, and they made an agreement that if they came back the next day, that they would refund the money, because I guess that's when the vending machine was getting restocked. That just stood out because I guess it would be that this John planned on coming back, or at least Jean was supposed to come back, and so the fact that John would know that, it seems odd that they were giving up some info about themselves. So by the end of the night, the dark-haired John decided that he was going to catch the bus home, and he ends up leaving Jean, Helen, and the red-haired John behind. And the three of them decide to camp together. So the reasoning for this was, I guess, the John pushed that he didn't want the girls to be going home alone, which seems like he's just being a gentleman. But he also pushed for Jean to be dropped off first because she lived the furthest away. And also he had been spending the night mostly talking to Helen, so it makes sense that he wanted Jean to get dropped off first. But, I mean, Jean gets a lot of flack for leaving her sister with John, but also, if you're in a situation where, if the guy's saying, I want to make sure she's not dropped off alone, I mean, it's hard to say no if the guy's trying to be a gentleman, so I think that Jean was just She did her best. She stuck with her sister all night, and she really helps with the investigation later. But I can see why people are like, how could you leave her alone with this guy? But it makes sense if you think that she was just trying to, look out for her in the way of saying, oh, he's just gonna help her get home. And so also while they were in the car together, while they were in the cab together, John gives up a lot of info about himself, actually. She didn't really remember the exact full name that he gave her, but she thinks that it was something like John Simpleson, John Templeson, or John Emerson. She also remembered that he said that he lived in the area Glasgow, and that he lived in a smaller area of Glasgow called Castlemilk. I don't know if I got that right, and that he had a steady job, but he wasn't married. And she also remembered during the cab ride home that he kept touching a pin on his jacket in a weird way, that she felt that he was almost trying to hide it so that they couldn't see it. He also spoke very military-like, almost condescending and judgmental. And she said that he could have been an I don't know what I'm saying. Authoritarian? That's what I meant? Okay. He had a demeanor that was military-like, and he also spoke about religion a lot. Somehow, during the conversation, he talked about religion. He said that he grew up very religious, but with all the rules, he thought that he and his sisters could never quite be as good as his parents. So he threw out that he has sisters. He also said that his dad told him that places like Barrowland were dens of iniquity, and married women who frequent those places are adulteresses. He said that's what his dad thought. It's not really clear if that's what he believed, but the fact that he even mentioned it to two ladies that he picked up from these places is pretty odd. He also mentioned that he didn't like golf too much, but that he had a cousin who once shot a hole in one. So she picked up on these things about him. And he also, during the short ride, had recited scripture and made references to Moses. When they talk about what plans he had for New Year's Eve, he said, I don't dance on Hogmanay, I pray. So the Hogmanay is the Scottish New Year's. When Jean described him, she said that he was slim, 6 feet tall, 25 to 35 in age, and blue-green eyes, and a distinct smile because one of his front teeth were slightly overlapping the other. Jean swears that she was sober while other people that were at the club remembered her being quite drunk and inebriated. Now, this might have been because she got into that little brawl with the manager and made a scene. So maybe people were like, that lady is gone. But she says that she was pretty sober by this point, by the time they were heading home, and others say that she didn't seem super sober while she was there. So that's why some people question what she remembers, but honestly, she remembered quite a bit from the conversation. So I'm going to take her word for it. She was first to be dropped off, and then the plan was for him to drop off Helen and then go home, but Helen never made it home. George, her husband, tried to wait for his wife, but by 3 a.m. he fell asleep, and when he wakes up the next morning, she still wasn't home. She was actually lying in the back garden just a few houses down from where he was. So again, it seemed like they were on the way home when she was attacked. She was found face down with clothes disheveled and torn all around her. She had been strangled with her own stocking, and she'd been sexually assaulted, and the contents of her handbag were dumped around her, but the bag itself was gone and never found. And like the other two women, Helen was on her period, and there was a sanitary napkin on the ground next to her. Helen was also different because she had a bite mark, and the impression that was left in the bite mark on her body confirmed what Jean had said about the one tooth overlapping the other tooth. So the bite mark confirmed that. So basically, then now they know that the guy that was in the car with her had to be the one that killed her. This time, the police linked this case with the other two pretty quickly, and they knew that they had to act fast because these victims were getting killed all from the same spot. So they tried to bring in Jean to make a better sketch of this John character, and I'm going to PTR the better sketch that was made. So he's a redhead, but also remember, this isn't like he's a redhead in US. He's a redhead in Scotland. So that's actually a lot more common. So he could be anybody. But he does give off this very clean cut appearance. He was wearing a suit from the witnesses, from what they say. And this was the sketch that was shared all throughout the UK, even overseas. They shared it at military bases overseas, trying to see, because they said the way that he talked was in a military manner. They even went to barbers to try to see if his haircut, if they could remember his hair. And also it said that his haircut was cut short, which was kind of out of style for that time. So they went there thinking maybe they remembered him that. And they also went to different churches because he was religious. Once the police gave information to the media and they announced that they were looking for a killer, that's when the media put together the name Bible John. So he got that from the media because of the religious ramblings that he was talking to Jean about in the car. So he didn't even get his nickname until the third victim. The police really go to work on this. They had a team of over 60 agents that went undercover at the Barlin Bar, the Barlin Ballroom. Like I said, they checked golf courses, they looked everywhere, and it's actually really sad. And it's been, over 30 years? They had, 50 years. What am I talking about? Yeah, sorry. They had over 5,000 suspects in total during this time, and they had over 100 officers covering the case at different times. And in that time, they had gotten over 50,000 statements, and it's still unsolved. But there were suspects. There was, soon after Helen's murder, there was a man by the name of John Edgar that was arrested right outside Barlin Ballroom. He actually, he got away from police by jumping through a plate glass window in a hospital, and for years he was a prime suspect. But years later, they actually found that years later he actually came forward because he was like, hey, they keep saying that I'm this guy and I don't want to be known as this guy. So he submitted his DNA. There was DNA that was found on Helen's stocking at the crime scene. So before the stockings were taken, but Helen's crime scene, the stocking was left behind. Also at her crime scene, he left a bite mark. So it's almost as if he's getting sloppier or he's getting cockier. But at her scene, there was DNA found that they collected, and they compared it with this guy, and it was not a match. So there was another theory that was out there. One person thought that Bible John could have been a police officer. And this theory is backed because he thinks that both Johns that night could have been police officers. And that's why the second John, the dark-haired John, hasn't come forward and say that he knows. Because that's also a weird part. Like, at first, the first two victims, it seems that they were picked up by these guys. It could be possible that John that night came with his buddy too, and that he just was like, I'm gonna go home with this girl. But it is odd that once they release all this information about Bible John and his ramblings and all of that his friend John, the dark-haired one that was hanging out with Jean all night, that he didn't come forward. So this theory that they're both police officers kind of makes sense, because obviously if one of them comes forward, then they're both in trouble and it could ruin their whole reputation. So it's an interesting theory that it could be a police officer, but also kind of wild to think that if you know that the police officers are looking for a guy that looks like this with a tooth that overlaps the other one, that they wouldn't have spotted the guy that they work with unless he had the tooth thing. Well, I don't know, but that is a theory that was thrown out there. So also another theory was that there was a man named John Irving McInnes who was a salesman, a furniture salesman, so it would explain him being dressed nicely. It's kind of not very clear how they got to him specifically, but basically the idea was that the DNA from the stockings matched potentially someone in his family, or like it had to do with the DNA in the stockings, and that's how they got to him. But he had actually committed suicide in 1980 by the time they had got to him, and he was 41 at the time that he committed suicide. So they had to exhume his body in 1996 just to compare his DNA to the DNA found on the stocking. And when they did, came back inconclusive. But this guy, John Irving McInnes, was a very religious man, and that he would often recite scripture. So because this DNA that kind of brought them to him was the reason behind like exhuming his body, it's still a decent lead, but it was inconclusive, so they might never know if that was actually him. The last suspect that they point to a lot, actually, and one of the best podcasts that I listen to Morbid a lot, but Morbid covered this guy specifically, Peter Tobin, the week before they covered the Bible John case. And if you want to know more about what Peter Tobin actually got arrested for, he's a whole mess in and of himself. But there's this guy, Peter Tobin, and I'll kind of put up a picture of them next to each other. He's the one that a lot of people point to, even though the investigators have like staked their entire career that it's not him. This is the guy that a lot of people point to, and this is why. So Peter Tobin, he was also a serial killer. He was convicted of 3 murders from the years 2007 to 2009, so many years later, and during that time he was in his early 60s. So the investigators during this time said because of how he acted during the 3 murders he's convicted of, it was clear to them that these weren't his first murders. So he was suspected of doing many more, but he was only ever convicted of 3. And if he were to start killing in his early 20s, it would have been the 1960s. So he would have been living and Peter himself lived in the Glasgow area in the 1960s. Also, Peter Tobin had many aliases. He had like over 50 aliases. One of them specifically that stuck out was the name John Semple. And if you remember what Jean said, she said that he gave the name John Templeton, Sempleton, or Emerson. So John Semple sounds a lot like what Jean was saying. He also was a little bit shorter, though. He was about 5'10", and Bible John was around 6 feet tall. So it's not too far off, but also Tobin himself doesn't have red hair. He has a darker brown hair. But Tobin's wives said that actually one of his wives he murdered, but his other wives, I believe there was 3 in total, said that he would beat them, and also mentioned that whenever they were on their periods, it would send him into a fit of rage. He was also a devout Roman Catholic and was very religious. Another reason people point to Peter Tobin is probably the part that's going to give you chills, but he had his front tooth pulled, his front tooth, and it never really explained why he got this front tooth pulled, but people say that he probably got that front tooth pulled because he didn't want his bite mark to match up to the one that was found on Helen, which is a very good theory. But they were never able to connect Peter to the cases themselves. I mean, he's not a redhead. The picture that they show of this guy, the fact that he has red hair, they really stick to that. And so maybe it's possible that Peter Tobin was the other guy, and that that's why he covered up the bite mark, because he met up with the other John later, and they do this together. But as far as him not being a redhead, that kind of is why people say it can't be him. He also never confessed to those crimes, but he is in jail. I think he's in jail still today because he went away in 2009. But yeah, so people point to him because of the teeth pulling thing. Maybe he bit someone else and that's why he had his teeth pulled. But I also couldn't find if he had that tooth overlapping before he had the tooth pulled. So not really sure if it would have even made sense to do that. Also, when Peter Tobin is caught, his MO is very different. He would pick up a few of his victims at the Barland Ballroom, but the way that he killed them was different. He didn't display them at all, hide the bodies himself, and some of them weren't found at all. So it's just different MOs, and that could have been because he escalated over time or because he caught, I don't know, but it didn't really add up to, it seems like the way that Bible John does his killings is so specific, and he uses the stockings, he uses a sanitary wipe, he leaves, he always takes the purse, but leaves some things behind. It's almost as if he went backwards. If you think about how clean the first one was, he took everything. He even took the purse, and all he left behind was the sanitation napkin. And then by the third one, he's leaving everything except the purse. And by doing that, he's even leaving a bite mark and DNA on the stocking. So it's like almost he's going backwards. But that also leads into the theory that it's possible that Bible John might not have existed, which is an interesting one. People say that it's possible that the first one was a one-off and that the other two were copycats. But what's weird to me, and what sticks out to pretty much anyone if you read the story, is why and how did he find 3 women on their period? And it could also be because maybe he was taking these women home, and then when they thought that things were going to get hot and heavy, they said, hey, it can't happen because it's my time of the month, and that caused this person to lash out at them and lose his cool. If you are religious, I guess there was something in the Old Testament about when you're on your time of the month, it's like you're not clean. So maybe if he was a devout religious person, that's what caused him to lash out. But the idea that it's not a serial killer and that it's different people is kind of odd if you think about how specific the way of killing was, but also maybe they just picked it up from the media and were like, I'm angry that I can't hook up with this. I don't know. The idea that Bible John doesn't exist isn't my favorite. I can understand it since the first crime compared to the last one were so different in how clean he was. And if you think like the sanitation napkin was such a big part, then it's almost like why did he get sloppier as he went on, unless it is a cockiness thing. But I mean, once the police linked the first 2 together, the third one got linked to them pretty quickly. So also, why did he stop? And why was it that he moved? Was it that he got scared that they were going to catch him? Like, did he change his MO? Because Peter Tobin still went back and picked up his victims from the Barrel ballroom. So it's almost like, I don't know, it's confusing to think that like this could have been copycats. I don't believe that. I think it's one guy, but I also don't understand why he almost went backwards in everything that he did and his whole MO. But yeah, so that's the theory of the Bible John. It's possible that I also like the theory that those 2 Johns were working together. I think that the fact that the second John from that night hasn't come forward really shows that either he knows what his friend does or he does it with his friend and they just like kind of trade off. So that's another working theory too. But it's been over 50 years. Yeah, because this was 1969. So yep, over 50 years now, and they still haven't found it. And to this day is the biggest manhunt in Scotland, and they still haven't found where he is. Probably by this point, this is an updated sketch of what they think he looks like now, based on, they didn't get that part right, but they forgot the tooth part, but this is what they thought based off his picture, what he might look like now. His hair would have gotten lighter, and so that if you've seen a man that looks like this in Scotland, then potentially he's 6 foot and very religious. So yeah, that's Bible John. If one has a theory that I didn't mention, or if anyone's really into the idea that it's Peter Tobin, because that seemed to be the one that came up over and over again, even though investigators were like, no, that's not our guy. Maybe it's just that, like, I don't know why they'd want to not link him, but maybe it's because he just didn't confess to it and he confessed to the other ones. I'm not really sure. But Peter Tobin is a terrible man, all in all. And I encourage you guys to listen to that Morbid episode because he's a rough one. But yeah, if anyone wants to come up, Danielle, I know you said you didn't know about this one beforehand, but it's really like famous for that area because I guess that it's like a known name, where here it's not really talked about as much, but it is really sketchy. It's almost like they're Jack the Ripper, because it's like you never know if he's done or if he just changes MO. That's the weirdest part for me, because 3 murders, all of them over time kind of showing different sides of him and leaving a witness as much as her sister was. Like, you spent the whole night with her sister, and even took the cab home with her and just rambled on about your life. So it's like, was he getting cockier, or was like, or did was he planning on doing something with the sister and he was just like, no, I just want Helen? It's very strange that he would even risk that, since the other two women before that, they didn't have anyone with them. So maybe it's because his friend was with him that he decided to go for the sisters, but it's a bold choice. So this guy is a piece of work. But maybe he got overconfident. Yeah, look at me. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. He got overconfident. I don't know. Does anyone think that he just moved away and that's why they were never able? Oh, sorry, Des.
I've been trying to pull her up. I don't know. It hasn't worked. I don't know if she made a mistake and did it, or she may need to leave and come back in.
Hello. I do it. Never know. Des, if you want to come up, if you want to leave and come back, it might be a glitch. I think there's an update today, so it might be glitching. Yeah, that's Bible John. I also thought that Bible John happened like not that long ago. I was actually shocked when it was the late 60s. I thought it happened in the 90s.
Yeah, I thought the same thing initially, but that story was wild. And I don't know, I guess I didn't get a chance to hear it all because I'm having work done and my background will get really noisy. But I don't know, maybe he did move away.
Yeah. It's also like, if he moved away, you'd think that it's such a specific thing that these women were all, at the time of the month, they're all in their period. So it's like, if he did move away, if that was his MO, then I kind of understand the theory that he's just a guy that goes out and picks up ladies at the bar, and that when he thinks that he's gonna get with them and finds out that they're on their period, he lashes out and and that's where it stems from. But it's also strange that they're sexually assaulted if the idea that they're unclean while they're on their period should, you would think, keep them away from assaulting them, but it doesn't seem to. So it's like almost contradicting that, I can understand if you're lashing out, and I don't not understand, but like if you just see red, pun not intended, but you just see red and you just like lash out because you had different plans for the night, but then why the extra step of like staging the body and like putting the sanitary napkin out there? It's just like, it's that part of it seems definitely
it's very odd.
Yeah. So it's like, how did he, if he is specifically looking for women that are on their period, how is he getting to that point? It's odd and very creepy. That, like, I don't know, and that part is just weird, because that's the biggest question: is he looking for women that are in this state, or is it that like it would have gone differently if they weren't in this state? It's like, that's the weird part. Because unless he's hiding in the bathroom, I don't know how he would find that out before they're heading home.
Right. I thought it was so odd, because it was like, how would he know?
Yeah.
How would he know? Unless he had been watching them. Ladies, watch out when you go to the stores.
Yeah. Right. And then it's like, if he was watching, was this his way of like cleansing? Because like if he was super religious, and it's possible that that was seen as unclean, like was this his way of cleaning? I don't understand it. Like, I don't get the sanitary wipe part at all, especially if the theory is that he took their sanitary wipe, because you also have to know that the chick is gonna have a sanitary wipe on her, which I guess, like, yes, I mean, I would carry on my person if it's that time of the month. I would plan on keeping extra things in my purse, but it's also like kind of a gamble on his end that they would have it on them. I don't know. Because, I mean, what is he using the sanitary wipe for? It was just laid next to them, unless that's how he cleans up, is with their own stuff, and he literally has nothing on him that's, like, ready for the kill, and he's just going off whatever's in their bag, which is also a gamble. So it's weirdly planned but unplanned in how he goes about it. And I don't like how he goes from very clean and like, posed to completely changing. That's why, if it is a copycat, that's wild. Like, if it became a thing that, oh, I'm gonna pick up this chick, and if it turns out we can't hook up because of this, I'm gonna get rid of her and pose her like this Bible John character, which is even more terrifying because then it could be really anybody. But this is what he's supposed to look like today. So if anyone's seen guy, look out.
So many people that he looks like. Like,
Right? He looks like Whipple. That's the freaky part. Like, I mean, this is Scotland and he's redhead. I mean, he picked a good spot. It's possible he dyed his hair after all the pictures went out. But I mean, the fact that they couldn't even trace him down to the dentist that they went to is like, what'd he do with the tooth? If maybe he pulled it just like Peter Tobin did, or maybe like he still has that tooth and no one's picked up on it. I don't know. Like, to pull a front tooth is very noticeable. So it's weird that the dentist in the area didn't even. I mean, unless he did it himself, that's possible too. But I mean, could have been Peter Tobin and he just hasn't come forward about it. But Peter Tobin if that's the case, Peter Tobin went from displaying his bodies and putting them near the spot where they intended to go anyway. Probably all of them were found just yards away from their final destination. So he went from doing that to taking victims, and I believe he hid the bodies, and a couple of them weren't even found, but they ended up arresting him for murder of 3 women. 2 of them he picked up from the Barrowland ballroom. So it's the same pickup point, and Tobin's a decent theory, but he doesn't look enough like the sketch. So that's kind of the part that trips you up. If we go off the sketch, and like I said, but there's a reason they don't usually use sketches, and if Jenny's available, if she knows more about that. But basically all I found about why they don't really use sketches was just because it's not a great source of like evidence. If they try to convict someone and they don't look enough like the sketch, could really trip them up. But so it makes sense, but it's also kind of interesting that we use them all the time in the States, and sometimes they've been way off actually. So maybe we should kind of look to that. Yeah, no one wants if you want to come up and share. Oh, if you thought women went to the bar were easy to grow up with surprise if they let him meet. Oh, that's true too. I mean, that makes sense too. If you think like this place is a place where people go to, like, you know, and they have the intention of, I'm going to pick someone up and it's going to be like a one night thing, then you pick up a girl and she's on her period, you could lash out just because, like, why would she going out dancing if she knew she couldn't be active, you know? That could piss them off too. So that's a good point. That, like, why are you going out if you can't if we can't get jiggy with it? But yeah, that's interesting because I mean, yeah, they just wanted to go out and dance. I mean, that's what Helen was doing. Helen was married. It was just that she wanted to go dancing and have a night out, and the other ladies too. It was like they just wanted a fun night with their girls, and I guess this guy was not having it. So yeah, that's really sad to think that you can't even go out dancing. You're supposed to stay inside the whole time if you're on your period. That's some bullshit. But yeah, so that's Bible John, still unsolved, and maybe eventually. I mean, a lot of the stuff that they gathered from at least Peter Tobin happened in 2009 when he was arrested. So, I mean, maybe we won't find anything to conclude. All we have is a little bit of DNA from the stocking that they collected in 1969. So it's way before DNA was really able to be used, but they have it, and they had that one guy, but it was inconclusive. So it is possible that he died, and that's why he never struck again. That maybe he died, or if he was in the military, maybe he went away or something, or yeah. But maybe he thought himself to be unclean, and then, you know, took his own life like one of the suspects did. So that could have been him too. But it's one of those mysteries, and thankfully he did stalk, so you don't have to. I mean, unless he strikes again 50, 60 plus later, which is going to be impressive if he's that old and he strikes again, but not impossible. So yeah, that was Bible John. And
wow, Emmy, thanks. That was such a great room. I didn't know about Bible John, but I would like to thank you for hosting this great room, and I'd like to thank the audience for sitting here listening to it. And I hope that y'all have any questions or any theories that you put them down in the comments, because we would love to hear them. So thank you.